Howdy everybody, this is Professor Keegan and I'm here with our final video lecture for the semester. Wow, I can't believe that we've made it this far. And I hope you're all doing well, staying safe, staying inside, and being careful about our current situation. So before I get started with this lecture, I am going to walk you through some just final reminders for the next couple of weeks. I'm also going to grab Daphne. I know some people requested that she make an appearance. She's not too happy about it. She's crawling all over my office. A few reminders about how we're proceeding with the remainder of the course. So, just a quick reminder that I am taking delayed work up through Thursday. This means keyword essays that needed revision or to be turned in and didn't get to me yet. Commenting on various discussion entries as you'd like to do, as well as the actual discussion entries. There are 6 for each person in the course. So if you're missing any of those that should have been turned in post going remote, you can still get them to me up until Thursday. Just a reminder though, don't just drop work into Blackboard without notifying me, because Blackboard doesn't always alert me and your work might go missing. So please do, if you're going to be submitting something past the due date, please do let me know you're doing that, just so I can make a note of it and make sure that you get credit. And then lastly, our final exercise is a reflection sheet that I've loaded into Blackboard under assignments, and that is going to be due by the 23rd at 4. Some of you have already completed this. Excellent. Others of you probably still need to get started on it. I'm hoping it won't be too time-consuming. If you've been kind of tracking your own progress in the course and engaging materials, you should be fine. So if there are questions about that assignment, you can certainly reach out to me via Slack or email as well. Okay, so that's really all I have right now. We are in the final unit of the course, which is called Queer Futures, and we are discussing the period of time really post-AIDS crisis to now, and more specifically probably the year 2000 to now. So 20-ish years of really recent queer history. And I've chosen this image to start the presentation off with because this is an image from Leo Herrera's video series Fathers. I've assigned the first episode of that for you for Thursday. And this is an image of somebody who is a member of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who are a group that was formed in the late 1970s, early 80s to minister to people dying of AIDS. And they're still around. They sort of have like a quasi-religious organizational structure, and you can actually join and become a novice and then, one of these sisters still today. So I just thought I would explain the background of this image so that when you see these people in the video, you know who they are. Okay, so Queer Futures. This lecture is really a compression of 2 days worth of content. So there's the content you looked at for today, which was the Eisners Toward a Bisexual Revolution, and then the final chapter of Stryker's Transgender History. And then for Thursday, I asked you to take a look at Leo Herrera Fathers, episode 1. It's only about 8 minutes, so please do watch that. And then a very short reading from Jose Munoz, who's a queer theorist. All around the concept of kind of like, what's the current landscape and then where are we heading? So what is the future and how can we work to make the future a place where queer people can exist? So just a quick recap. In terms of the landscape we've been kind of tracing, when we looked at content at the end of the last unit on the AIDS crisis and now this content, I'm putting Schulman. Schulman kind of bridges these 2 units, and the reason why is because her book really helps us think about how the AIDS crisis, we are still living in the aftermath of that crisis, and it can be important to realize that because the history isn't really taught, but of course the effects are still there. So it's not like just because we aren't aware of those shifts that we haven't experienced them, if that makes any sense. So I think her book is really good at helping us get more attuned to the effects we're living with that we might not have even realized were present. So she describes the gentrifying effects AIDS has had on gay culture and political thought, and we've covered that. And we've discussed some of the outcomes of this, right? This rise of gay marriage and military service as central movement goals, um, the gentrification of previously mixed class and mixed race queer neighborhoods that started to become these like white gay sort of upper class areas, the loss of queer public space, particularly places where you can go meet queer people who aren't necessarily from your same class or racial background. And all of that has been replaced with like apps and online communication. The rise of virtual communities, the loss of artists and thinkers, and the people who stepped into those gaps and started creating content. I talked about that last week. And then also a new kind of ethic, instead of an ethic of like sort of like open sexuality and sexual expression. What we have is a new focus on individualism and risk aversion. So people start getting really more focused on monogamy, they get more focused on marriage, and these start to be the priorities. So Schulman has been talking about these shifts, which we could say have developed this kind of homonormative style of gay politics that we've all kind of grown up with in the 21st century. Um, but then Stryker's chapter traces an alternate timeline, right? Where it's the same timeline, but it's a different politics that she traces, where we see some of the liberationist responses to the gentrification that Schulman is describing. And so in response, what we see is queer politics, trans movement building, and queer theory and transgender studies developing to kind of push back on these changes that Schulman is noting in her book. So Stryker notes that, trans people didn't get a lot of attention during the AIDS crisis till very late, but once they did, there was AIDS funding that was earmarked specifically for trans populations, and that had the effect of bringing trans people back together in a new way, and identifying trans communities in a way that then trans people started to be able to kind of build community inside that structure of being an at-risk population. And then also, we started out class with a text, Queers Read This, that shows how these AIDS crisis coalitions began to kind of develop an anti-assimilationist politics called queer politics. So queer was actually in opposition to this kind of homonormative gay rights discourse. And that queer opposition was very evident during the AIDS crisis with things like ACT UP, Queer Nation, but it didn't necessarily go away at the end. And so what we have is like these two groups with like different strategies and different priorities kind of left behind. So one thing I really want to stress by putting Schulman and Stryker next to each other the way I have is how homonormative and liberationist traditions have always been kind of in this like dialectical relationship where one will sort of start taking over and then the other will start to push back, right? And what we have at the end of the AIDS crisis is a situation where the homonormative positions are very in a more authoritative space. They are running the show, but the liberationist style has not gone away and is still present, opposing and questioning the priorities of the more homonormative camp. So it's an ongoing struggle between these two modes. Along with this, we have the rise of two words we've been using all class, queer and transgender, but were not used in the way that they are currently until this period. So, post 1990, and really kind of in the decade between 1990 and 2000, we start to see these terms emerge into new uses. So queer had previously been used as a slur, an anti-gay slur, and transgender had not been widely used outside of a few kind of small groups of people. But in the 90s, suddenly everyone starts to use these terms. and they're using them in a rearticulation of the liberationist politics. So as kind of homonormativity takes over, there's a pushback from liberationists, and they start using these terms queer and transgender to build more kind of intersectional communities in response. So we see the use of queer, a political use of this word that names a politics in resistance to these assimilationist goals of the official gay rights movement. So we see groups like Queer Nation. We see texts like Queers Read This beginning to be circulated. And by the year 2000, queer has gone from a slur to really like this new idea of a politics of anti-assimilationist agenda. Um, Simultaneously, transgender also starts getting used as an umbrella term to collect all gender nonconforming people into a single community. So, trans people had been kind of on the margins of the gay community for quite a while by the 90s, for maybe 15 years, 20 years. And so, this new term, transgender, which had been floating around since the 60s, starts to get used as a way of thinking about what if we could broaden our community and gather together all kinds of trans people, plus people who cross-dress, plus people who identify as transsexual, plus people who are non-binary, plus people who are genderqueer, right, or gender fluid. And so that has the effect of like broadening the trans community and making it a bigger group. And new groups start to form within that context. So we have groups like the Transsexual Menace, we have Transgender Nation, we have Leslie Feinberg, who's the person with the gray hair in this photo right here, writing the book Transgender Liberation, A Movement Whose Time Has Come, which comes out in the early 90s. And so we start to see these new kind of liberationist energies attached to these new terms. Also, simultaneously, we have the fields of queer theory, transgender studies, and LGBTQ studies, which is kind of a blending of those two things. Those begin to form. And they start to develop new ideas about gender and sexuality internal to the academy. Excuse me. So basically, like, this is an LGBTQ studies course, and it's not even until probably the mid to late 90s that we have the conditions in place to even develop a field. The field that we've been studying is really only about 20 years old, maybe 30 if you stretch it. So internal to this field of study, LGBTQ studies, we start to see, right, the use of queer as in queer theory. We have a course called Queer Theory at GVSU that I sometimes teach that critically investigates sexualities and their associated norms to illustrate how power produces the idea of sexuality itself. And then we also have the field of transgender studies developing, which is a field that investigates binary gender as an organizing principle of power. And so we have these fields that are critically investigating sexuality and gender at sort of like an academic and theoretical level. And so these things are tied together. The political and the theoretical start to be like two halves of kind of a new LGBTQ movement consciousness, you could say. So the current situation is one in which we're pretty divided along these lines of homonormative versus a more kind of liberationist strain of queer politics. And so what we've seen is that since 2000 and the end of the AIDS crisis, we have shifts in culture, law, and technology that have resulted in a new political realignment, which we could explain kind of flatly as a disagreement between an identity politics model and a queer/trans politics model. And let me explain what I mean by that. So identity politics is a term for a style of politics that became popular in the 1980s and has since increased in its popularity. And in this politics, it's basically people saying like, I have this identity and I don't have any control over the fact that I have this identity, and so the state should protect me. And so it's this use of identity to make claims about why someone should be treated a certain way. And so the way that this has broken down in the LGBTQ community is that because it kind of conceptualizes everyone as only having one identity, and you kind of have to choose which identity you're going to make claims using. And so in this model, L, G, B, and T are like these separate identity positions, which we know is not necessarily true because trans people can also be bisexual, gay, or lesbian. But this model really needs to understand people as having different separate identities and belonging only to one of only one identity group and not more than one. So the main focus of identity politics has been to win tolerance and inclusion from business and government entities. So rather than transforming the society to make it more equitable or just, what identity politics movements have done is say, well, we can't help being different, so you should tolerate us, or you should include us because we're no threat to you. Um, and so rather than changing society, just let people into the current structures. And so we can see how identity politics would result in an LGBT movement that's pretty focused on what we would call homonormative policy goals, like marriage equality, like corporate business policies that are inclusive to LGBTQ people. Military service. Anytime a group is just saying, "Well, just include us in a current structure," based on identities that we have no control over, that's kind of an identity politics model. Um, and this is reflected in the politics of major LGBT organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, which is the blue square here. You may see this decal on people's cars driving around. They're the largest and best funded LGBT rights group in the world. And interestingly, do not even have LGBT in the name of the organization. That should tell you something, right? It's like this kind of fuzzy, like, oh, human rights. And HRC infamously did not support trans people until very recently. They were pretty much like support gay people and leave trans people out of the conversation. Another group that uses an inclusion-based model is the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, which is a group that tracks and makes recommendations about representations of LGBT people in the media. And a lot of their policy goals have to do with like getting a certain number of characters that are gay on TV, or kind of criticizing what they would call negative representations of LGBT people in the media. And so GLAD is really interested in like making sure media has positive images only, and that LGBT people are presented in a positive light, and that we simply get included in a lot of places in the media where we're not included. And so it's kind of like, again, this emphasis on inclusion rather than making sure that like independent media producers can make their own stuff. That's not something GLAD is doing. They're just working with the major networks, television and networks and film studios. So those are two groups with these kinds of politics. Then there's queer or trans politics, excuse me, which, right, use queer and trans as these umbrella ideas. Like queer people, like the idea of queer is like everybody who doesn't fit the normative sexual system, or trans being everybody who doesn't fit the normative gender system, right? Using those terms to collect together many kinds of non-normative people. So there isn't just one identity that you have to belong or participate in this politics. It's open to anyone who's kind of in a non-normative or disempowered position. And the focus here is not on getting tolerance and inclusion from people with power, but rather building coalitions, non-identitarian coalitions around shared oppressions. So you could say, rather than saying all the people who identify as gay, let's petition NBC to have like a positive gay representation on NBC, right? That's one thing you could do with a kind of more identity politics model. A more coalitional queer or trans politics would say, let's look at everyone impacted by hunger, right? Because we know trans people are disproportionately impacted. We know people of color are. We know indigenous people are. We know disabled people are, right? We know poor people are. And pretty soon you have a much larger group of people who don't share an identity but all share a problem for various reasons. And so it focuses more on the problem than on the identity. And that allows you to, build bigger groups of people that are more diverse. And this style of politics places an emphasis on intersectional movement building, and really does use those liberationist models that we were looking at in the 1960s and 70s. When you think about GLF partnering with the Black Panthers, right? What is there about being gay or being black that would cause those groups to work together? It's about shared oppression under the same system. It's not about sharing an identity category. So some groups that do this kind of work are the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is a free legal clinic that works to help trans people get affirming documentation, like ID, or helps get them legal help with things like court cases and court fees and things like that. Or Black and Pink, which is an LGBTQ/POC prisoner rights organization that works to help people who are incarcerated. And so you could see how there's more focus on the problem rather than the identity. So this is where we're at. Like, not everyone agrees on which style of politics would be best to use. So the questions, at the end of class, I don't have answers to these questions, but I think these are the questions that remain, that are kind of with us today, if we're going to think about what kind of futures we want to build as queer people and as people who are looking to, sorry, my camera quit. People who are looking to move forward with queer politics. There are unanswered questions that we have to be working on together across this political divide. And so I'm just going to list some that I think are the most pressing in terms of our current moment. First, there's the question of what, if anything, LGBTQ people now share. During Stonewall and before, gay people, and I say gay meaning everybody, right? Because gay was a cultural term. It wasn't an identity term before the 1970s. Everybody in gay culture had a sense of shared oppression. The cross-dressing laws, the anti-sex laws, the obscenity laws, the police brutality, everything that was happening there was a kind of shared experience. But now it's not really clear because some, particularly white middle-class people and gay and lesbian cisgender people, have basically achieved near equality with straight people. And so they what holds the community together anymore? What is going to be the next shared experience that would galvanize us to do something like we did during the AIDS crisis or at Stonewall or at Compton's cafeteria, right? That is not clear. And it kind of seems like if you look at the history of queer organizing, that those kinds of shared moments are necessary to produce any kind of radical pushback from queer people. So that's unclear. Daphne's meowing at me. Two, how should we determine movement goals? By numbers, power, or need? The decisions that were made at the end of the AIDS crisis really did allow the people with the most power to make those decisions. And I think that's what Schulman's tracing in her book, is people with the most power generally avoided dying, and therefore were there when the crisis ended to kind of step into roles of leadership. Should it be people who have the highest numbers in the community? Because if that was so, then it would be bi people who ran everything. Bisexual people far outnumber gay, lesbian, or trans people. And that's why I asked on the discussion entry, what would it look like if we put the B first? How would the movement priorities change? Because they actually are the biggest group. Or by need, who is struggling the most? Who has the worst metrics? Who has the worst life outcomes? In that instance, we would probably need to center trans people of color, or intersex trans people. So it's not really clear how we make these decisions, and these political groups have different ideas about that. There's also the question, because AIDS removed nearly an entire generation of cultural producers, thinkers, educators from our community, it's unclear how we will preserve and transmit queer culture across that generational gap to younger people. Certainly, this class is one of those measures by which we can do that. But broadly, socially speaking, the internet doesn't really seem to be necessarily the best way to do this. So, how do young queer people get into contact with elders and learn about queer history and culture? Because young people are so protected from LGBT content in our current culture, because it's still a homophobic and transphobic culture, a lot of younger queer people still grow up with absolutely no actual rich access to these histories. How will we address the inequalities between trans people and hostile gay, lesbian, and feminist groups? This is something that really is a huge problem, especially for trans women who are often attacked by hostile trans exclusionary feminists. It's unclear how that um, divide could ever really be settled. And also between white LGBTQ people and non white LGBTQ people in terms of the inequalities and the different kinds of organizing models and the different policy agendas in those groups. We still haven't found a way to come back together if we ever were even um, all one community. We still haven't figured out how to do that in a way that would resolve these tensions. How we come to terms with the political and psychological costs of the AIDS crisis? This is something I think Schulman is asking. Um, she posits the idea of degentrification as the solution, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think one of the first solutions here is simply to become more aware of them. That's what we're doing in this class, like realizing that there's a historical event that caused the conditions that we are living in. Um, and then to maybe pursue ways of learning more about what was lost and learning more about that period. How will we address emerging crises like climate change, environmental degradation, and human migration? What does a queer movement look like in a world that's being massively disrupted at a global scale by these forces? I don't know. I hope to find out, but or like even pandemic, right? These are things that we've never really confronted before as a group of people. And lastly, how will we degentrify our culture and our vision for the future? And this is where I hope classes like this can help a bit in terms of really kind of contextualizing the queer culture we do have as only one small set of ideas for how queer people have created, lived, formed families in the past, formed communities. What you've been exposed to through the mainstream media is certainly not a diverse picture of queer meaning making or of queer history. So how do we start to maybe access or create things and share them in a way that could fill in that picture further? And along that line, I wanted to just briefly touch down on Schulman's concept of degentrification because I wanted to provide you with at least one example of art that kind of does this work. So I assigned episode 1 of Leo Herrera's Fathers, which is a science fiction web series exploring an alternative future America in which AIDS never took place. So in his version, it's 2020 in this video, but it's an alternative timeline where it's the 2020 that would have happened if the AIDS crisis never took place. Like if the government had taken fast action and like people hadn't died en masse and there hadn't been this like generational trauma and loss, what would have happened? What would queer culture look like? What would America look like? So this series highlights the unacknowledged costs of AIDS, right? It really wakes us up to how different things could have been without those losses. And it also explores what might have been achieved if the AIDS crisis hadn't given people a new context in which to create a huge backlash against queer people in the 80s and 90s, right? So we know that AIDS was weaponized against queer people who were seen as having caused it and spreading it. And what if that had never happened? How would the queer movement have progressed if gay liberation had not been interrupted by this crisis? What if Stonewall had just proceeded and we had never had this kind of conservative clawback, and then this massive shift in gay priorities in the mid 90s? What if we had just continued with the liberationist traditions that we formed in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and some of the 70s? So I highly recommend you watch this first episode. It's only about 8 minutes. And if you want to watch the other episodes, they're also available for free and you can watch them if you have time. But what's really interesting here is how Herrera like reimagines the United States. And in his version of the United States, um, queer culture has been granted religious protections. So imagine if making the argument that because queer sexuality and culture are sacred and motivated by a divinity, then because they are culturally specific traditions, that they've been, in his version of America, they've been granted like protection under the Bill of Rights. And so that has massively changed the ability for the country to oppress, right? Because now queer culture is considered equivalent to like Christianity or Judaism, which is a fascinating concept. And you'll notice as you move through this first video that literature we've even read appears. So Carl Whitman's The Gay Manifesto is cited. To be a free territory, we must govern ourselves, set up our own institutions, defend ourselves, and use our own energies to improve ourselves, right? That's a text we read for class. And in Herrera's alternative U.S., there's a Stonewall in a town called Stonewall in every single state that is queer, run, owned, collectively owned and managed. And they've become like queer colonies, like queer collectives, like Fawaz's article, right? So using some of those traditions of the 1970s, and bringing them forward in time, not having been interrupted by this ideology of gay marriage, right? What about collective living and communal living as solutions to some of the problems that queer people experience? And then Fathers also imagines Vito Russo, who is an AIDS activist, who's who died in the, I want to say, the mid 90s, maybe 1996, as the first gay presidential candidate. So instead of a military serving, Rhodes Scholar that we had with Pete Buttigieg, representing a very moderate form of democratic politics, we have this radical progressive candidate, Vito Russo, running for president in 2020 in Herrera's version. So what if the liberationist tradition was the dominant gay political tradition, even at the level of national politics? Fascinating questions. I really hope you watch this. I know I didn't assign a discussion entry for it, but it's just such a fascinating take on where we could be versus where we are. So I'm going to leave it there. This is my last video. Sorry my camera froze, so I can't be talking to you face to face. But I wanted to leave you with this picture of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, both wearing Stonewall Queen sashes. I just loved this image. To say a couple of things. First, I really want to thank you for all your hard work in this class this semester. It's been a real pleasure having each and every one of you in the classroom. And I'm just really sad that we weren't able to be together for the last 6 weeks of class. But I hope these videos and the content I've been posting and the discussions have been helpful in completing the course for you. And, I just really hope that this course has been transformative for you in some way. I will not be at Grand Valley next year. I'm going on research leave. So for those of you who are graduating this year or next, I just wish you the absolute best. Please don't hesitate to reach out, contact me any old time. And I'll be back the year after that for those of you who are still going to be pursuing your studies. So best of luck. I know we're not going to be having any more videos, but I will be over on Blackboard. I will be responding to all your work, and you can certainly reach out to me at any time. Okay? So, be well. That's it for now. Bye.